Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining from across the globe. My name is Rohan, and I would be the moderator for today's exciting event. I would firstly like to thank you for taking the time to attend this EdTech Power Hour session today. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, Power Hour is a series of interactive roundtable discussions amongst industry stalwarts where they would be sharing their experiences and insights on a particular topic. So the topic for today's discussion would be designing for next-gen outcome-based education model. Before we begin, a few quick housekeeping tips. In case you cannot hear the audio, ensure you have selected the right speaker for audio output. You may test the same to see if it is working fine from the audio settings option on the lower left corner of your screen. And if necessary, please dial in using a phone. With that, it's time for introduction. Our host for today's roundtable is Rahul Singh. Rahul is a digital learning enthusiast with over 15 years in the digital learning space. He is passionate about helping organizations and leaders solve challenges around learner engagement and student outcomes through intervention of learning technologies. We welcome you, Rahul, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Rohan, for the introduction. Thank you, everyone who's joining us from different parts of the globe for this discussion. We are looking forward to an interactive discussion with you. So at any point of time, if you have any questions, thoughts, comments, please feel free to type it in the chat box. I, along with our esteemed panelists and some other guests, we will take up turns and answer those questions and have those discussions with you. So once again, thank you very much for taking the time out for joining for this event. So what's our game plan for today? What are we going to talk about? I think the first one is we are going to talk about the role of outcome-based education model to bridge the skill gap. That's a big one. How can we leverage the academics to ensure that they can play a bigger and a better role in bridging the skill gap? We're also going to evaluate the three main components of a conventional outcome-based education model. We'll try to identify if there are any gaps in the conventional outcome-based education model. And at the end of it, we'll hear it from some industry leaders in terms of some examples of successful implementation of outcome-based education. And with that, let me take an opportunity to welcome our panelists for today. The first one on the board, we have with us Brian, the CEO at Perseverant. Good morning, Brian. Thank you very much for taking the time out for being on this event with us today.
Good morning. Great to be here.
Great. Brian, for the audience, could you, kind of briefly tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do, what's Perseverant all about?
Exactly. So my background is really in retail analytics. 20 years ago, probably by now, heavy, intense focus on tracking behavior online. And when we sold that company, which went into the market as Salesforce Predictive, we began to apply that analytic learning to education and how students engaged in a technical frame with content and learning outcomes. And it grew from there. And around 2015 or so, we really started launching full courseware solutions focused on really improving student outcomes across the board and specifically reducing the DFW rate for students. It's been quite a long journey.
Absolutely, Brian, and that's very interesting, right? An interesting shift. So what you learned in the retail industry, the analytics, you went ahead and deployed those learnings in the education space. So we'll love to hear more about when we progress in our discussion forward. So once again, thank you very much, Brian, for joining us on this discussion. Now, moving ahead, let me welcome my second panelist for the day today. We have Marwan, Director of Innovation from West Coast University. Good morning, Marwan. Thank you very much for being on this panel discussion so early in the morning, your time today.
Good morning. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Marwan. Marwan, for the audience, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do at West Coast University?
Certainly. My career has always been in higher education, better part of 21 years, held roles in instructional design, media development, IT operations, led online operations for West Coast University, scaled online programs for both private schools as well as startups towards 38,000 students at the largest. But most recently, my role with West Coast University has been to really explore the future and reimagining the student experience in order to achieve better engagement and better outcomes for our students.
Right. Thank you, Marwan. That's a long kind of long stint in the higher education space, and I think we would be very eager to listen to you in terms of how is it shaping up in terms of the future, and what are some of the things that we should take care of when it comes to the future. So once again, thank you very much, Brian, Marwan, for joining us on this show. So let's move ahead to this discussion. All right, so the first primitive question, what is an outcome-based education model? I'm sure we all know, we all understand what's an outcome-based education model, but I wanted to give it a flip here. In terms of an outcome-based education model, I wanted to pose this question to our panelists. And to Marwan, I wanted to request if you could share your thoughts in terms of what does it means from a student and faculty perspective.
Certainly. Before I got into education, I was an engineer. So I'll put it in simple terms. Outcome-based education is really about the output rather than the input. So we think about what does the student need to be able to accomplish after they leave us, as opposed to the knowledge that we want to impart on them or the curriculum that has been designed with specific content in mind as they go through the educational experience. At West Coast specifically, we think about what we want our graduates to be. We want to think about their employability. We want to think about their success within their first job. So it's not just about getting them to graduation, it's about getting them a job. And we even partner with employers to ask them, how can we get our graduates to be better equipped to handle that first week, first month, first year of the job?
Thank you, Marwan, for sharing those thoughts. I think what you mentioned was outcome-based education is not about inputs, but it's about outputs. That in itself says a lot. And I think if we can align our thoughts in those directions, that's a great value add. Now, let me take the opportunity and request Brian, from an EdTech product owner perspective, what does an outcome-based education model means?
Yeah, for us, it really means supporting the things that Marwan was talking about. So we're not necessarily designing what those outcomes should be. Professors at institutions are paid, obviously, very well to do that and figure that out, and they're the experts in their field. So we're not trying to figure out what those outcomes are, but rather provide all the tools, technologies for them to be able to accomplish those goals very well. So things like letting students have more of a hands-on engagement session with material before they go to class, using, let's say, anonymous graders so that students can be judged more fairly, setting up tools that set up standards for evaluating more complex question answer type quiz or test solutions against a rubric, for example, which can be more challenging in some cases to set up technology. And what we don't want to happen is for technology to get in the way of the instructor and the student. We want it to really enable the experience as much as possible, so that all those outcomes can be lifted. And so very much less interested in a curve aspect of how these outcomes are graded, but more trying to help every student get to mastery at their own pace. And so providing tools that let them work maybe independent of the classroom. If they need more time to catch up, if they need less time, they can go as fast as they want. So just enabling those aspects of what Marwan was talking about.
That's so great to hear, Brian, and thank you very much for sharing these thoughts. In fact, couple of things I would like to highlight that I heard from you in terms of the EdTech product owner doesn't decide how things will shape up. They are here to support the education leaders, the higher ed leaders in the education. So that's a great thing. It's not like that, here's this product, use it, you'll get results for an outcome-based education model, or you would be able to implement an outcome-based education model. So I think that's a very interesting perspective. The higher ed leaders who are listening to us, please take a note of it. The EdTech owners, product owners are listening to you. They would want to design products the way you would want to, uh, the way you would want them to perform. And the second one, Brian, the interesting part was helping students achieve mastery at their own pace. I think the conventional education model has always been trying to complete things in a certain period of time, in a certain particular period of time, and that kinds of doesn't allows an individual attention to a particular student or their particular needs. But looks like the outcome-based education model has that ability to give attention to an individual need as well. So thank you for those interesting thoughts. And moving ahead in our discussion, in our game plan, we spoke about how do we, try to bridge the gap between academia and the workplace of future. So before we get into that question, let's look at some statistics. This is a report from World Economic Forum. They listed down these top 10 work skills, which is required for employability by the end of year 2025. And if you look at the 4 quadrants here, it's problem solving, self-management, working with people, technology use and development. I think, Brian, in 1990, when you started your technical career, some of these skills might not have been in demand. I mean, social influence, who cares for it, right? You're good at coding and you can write good programs. You are an A player, you're a star player. But now looks like it might not be the case if you cannot navigate your way in an organization by influencing people. Your coding skills only will not help you much. So moving ahead in terms of these top 10 work skills, I wanted to pose this question to you, Brian. And so what is your take on these new skills? And do you think the outcome-based education model needs to be aligned with these demands?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think that in any way the education model needs to necessarily change to support learning those skills, right? So if we choose to help learners learn those skills, we should incorporate them into whatever education model we're using, at that institution. So I'd say that, like, I don't think those things are at odds at all. I do certainly think that there's a high demand for those skills. We have a resilience course that we do offer, and some early adopter institutions do deploy that course. Some, though, don't deploy it as its own course. They'll incorporate it into other courses. So the resiliency course may be incorporated into, right now we're seeing it in an English or psychology. And so your writing assignments may also deal with resiliency sometimes, or that educational material. So sometimes those items are being integrated into other courses. And of course, we're not stress testing students in a resiliency class as much as have they mastered some of the learning objectives incorporated with that material. So do they understand more about their self-talk and how damaging, maybe their own self-talk is to them? Have they learned those concepts effectively, which some of these things are really difficult to design what an outcome should be. And of course we just we work with professors of those courses to align those things.
Right, Ryan, and that makes sense. And thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. So it doesn't mean, what I heard from you is it's not necessarily that the outcome-based education model needs an overhaul to ensure that, the students can master some of those skills that we looked at right now, those top 10 skills. But there is a need to help them master the skills, and then the curriculum developers need to take a note of it, that how they can integrate these skills within the existing curriculums or the learning journeys that they plan. And the example that you gave of the resilience course, either the learners have an option to take it as a standalone or as integrated within an existing curriculum. So that's a good starting point, and you know that sounds good. Let's so moving ahead. Let's sorry, yeah, sorry, yeah. So moving ahead, let's look at this other statistics, wherein there's again this report from World Economic Forum, which says 3 ways to prepare students for the post-COVID job market. One of the things that it lists is digital equity. I think the pandemic taught us and made it very clear that there isn't something called, there isn't equity in the digital environment. So what we have to do is we have to teach through a mix of high tech, low tech, and no tech. The second one is fair evaluation process. There are education systems, education standards, which lay a lot of emphasis on exams. I mean, if you don't get good grades in the exams, that's the fundamental judgment point in terms of how they judge your capabilities or abilities. And the third one is life skills. So what we need to do is we need to empower youth with adaptability skills and financial resources. So considering this, I wanted to pose this question to Marwan and get his thoughts on this, that what role can outcome-based education play to prepare our students for the post-COVID job market?
Well, I think the pandemic has really put accelerated focus on the students' needs, as well as what institutions can do to support them. So I think about the post-COVID job market. Before we even get there, we think about what experience do we put our students through and how do we support them to get to that job. And one of the things that I'll go back to the example that Brian shared of having a resilience course, we need to think about our well-being of our students, their ability to have that grit and self-care. I have the pleasure of working for an institution almost entirely focused on healthcare, both in nursing as well as in graduate programs. And we've seen the value of our nurses on the front lines and what they have to deal with. So one of the things that we are working on is integrating grit into our first year experience course. So it's no longer just about being academically prepared, but it's being prepared as a person to enter the university and then to enter the job market. As a university, we also think about how do we support the students and how do we meet them where they are. So during the pandemic, we launched a communication platform that allows faculty and students to communicate via text message, whether you have a smartphone or not. Now we have lowered the barrier of communication and provided that sort of digital equity that a student, when they need help, as they need help, they can get it from a faculty in near real time. That doesn't mean our faculty are on 24/7, but it means that we took away some of those barriers of communication. And as far as fair evaluation process, that has probably been the most difficult aspect of the pandemic. Is how do you provide students the skills, attitudes, and knowledge and values almost entirely in an online environment? And I think the answer in healthcare is that it's likely not possible entirely on an online environment, but our students and our faculty have found creative ways to do that. So when we used to demonstrate skills in person, we've deployed YouTube videos produced by the university for our students and the world to share on how these skills can be performed. And what we found is that our students have those videos on the iPad and iPhone, and then they have the supplies that we send them home, practicing, on a pillow dressed in a t-shirt, with the equipment that they would use in our skills lab. So I think the job of the university, the job of our faculty and our institutions is to think about how do we prepare the students and how do we provide the right experiences. So traditionally, when I was leading an instructional design team, we'd think about instructional design and we'd think about building courses and courseware. Now that I have transitioned into a role of innovation, we hire learning experience designers, thinking about the entire experience for the student and what we want them to go through and perform and demonstrate before we get to the outcomes that we're desiring.
That's so wonderful, Marwan. I think I would like to, pick your brain on one particular aspect that you mentioned. I think that could be a potential game changer. We spoke about digital equity, tech, low tech, no tech. And you mentioned the text-based messaging way of communication and learning. And there are a few learning platforms who are coming up with text-based learning and messaging way. Is it okay with you? If it's okay with you, can you just throw a little bit more light in terms of how you have implemented this and what benefits are you seeing out of it?
Sure. I don't want to mislead the audience. We didn't implement text messaging as a learning tool, but rather as a communication tool to support the student in their learning process. But what we found is that some of our best faculty recognize the value of using that short message format to reinforce the learning. So for example, we in healthcare, we usually teach to a board exam or to a specific outcome like NCLEX in the case of nursing. And one of our faculty would promise for their students at the beginning of the term that every day you get an NCLEX style question from me via this messaging platform. So students wake up to a new test question and then have to think about how they answer it. And with that space and repetitive learning, they're able to retain that knowledge. But that's not the only mobile type of communication or mobile type of deployment that we have done. We are in the process of deploying a game to help students learn medical terminology. Brian mentioned that it's not about the time, limited time to master content, but perhaps it's about getting to content mastery. In the US, at least, we have the credit hour system and we have all of the regulatory restrictions that don't necessarily allow us to have the true outcomes-based model. But when we think about these horizontal competencies and perhaps interdisciplinary competencies, how can we provide these experiences that span the student matriculation process? So the game is built not for a specific course, but for a specific knowledge that is valued across courses, and that's medical terminology. So as far as we know, there's no other game on the App Store that teaches students medical terminology. There may be flashcards and others, but there's no game mechanics to help students learn medical terminology. And we know that they need that type of skill to succeed in their anatomy and pathophysiology and nursing fundamentals course. So as a university, we invested in building a game that a student can play and achieve that type of competency at their own pace. So when they come to class, when they go to their job, they have mastered that content.
Thank you, Marwan, for sharing those thoughts. And Brian, let me just ask you this question. So these couple of things that Marwan just mentioned in terms of this text-based communication methodology, and can we extend it to learning? And this game-based, I would rather say simulation-based learning, wherein students are trying to master their skills. What's your take on that? I mean, are these some things which can help? Can we blend it in the outcome-based education model, and can we derive impactful results out of it?
Yeah, definitely. I think we don't necessarily deploy text messaging. Most of the students, if not all, have a smartphone or even Chromebook technology or tablet technology. So a lot of what we're deploying is based around that students will have those, and in cases where they don't, we're trying to make sure they do have those so they can participate. But like you said, that's more challenging. So our solution for those student engagements is typically a little more on the low tech side to make sure that everyone can get access, but we're seeing things in the marketplace where simulation is really going to all new heights, right? As far as even virtual reality, where you perform tasks in different situations in a virtual reality environment. And I don't think those, are happening in a distance learning COVID-19 type era as we've seen, for the last time period. But, in institutions that have labs that can provide, the facility to do that, things are getting, very much more advanced, than they ever have been. So I think on the simulation side, I would expect that only to grow and get bigger. I think on the communication side, extremely important. That's why we have robust, analytics that monitor basically everything the student does engaged with the course. And then we can highlight to instructors, students that are having or struggling with certain content areas, so the instructor can actually reach out proactively. Of course, the student can always reach out to the instructor, but some may not feel comfortable. Some may not actually feel comfortable receiving the engagement from the instructor, quite frankly. We've seen that as well, but the tool is there. And, I think instructors want to help students succeed. So if they see and can quickly find students who are struggling, or even find them struggling with a certain topic, they can reach out. And we don't want things, of course, to be too big brother creepy. I say that, from sort of my retail background, we got a lot of that. Like, it's a little too invasive sometimes, but we're trying to really enable instructors to understand where students are struggling, and be able to engage them specifically on those topics. So if you're having trouble understanding VO2 max, I don't want to reach out to you and just say, hey, are you having trouble? I can now reach out and say, hey, I know that, we seem to be having a little more trouble with VO2 max understanding, or maybe we're doing it in a flip the classroom type concept. You don't have to single out an individual. You can just bring it up in the classroom in a more broad context, depending on, the instructor's style or how they see fit. So, but opening up better pathways of communication, and being able to intervene, and help students get that access, I think can only get better from here, and probably should be continually reinforced. It's helpful to students.
I'd like to agree with Brian, is especially regarding intervention and getting every student to success. So the days of the bell curve, look to your left, look to your right, one of those people is not going to be here at the end of the term. These days are over. I mean, we really have to think about success for every student, and how can we achieve that? And at West Coast, we call that a student-centric model. So if we can achieve 100% graduation, we want to achieve, and we will achieve it, and we'll do everything that we can to do that. And I wonder, Brian, this is just kind of a question, to you and perhaps to the industry in general. I've been on the tech side, and I understand the value of data and providing it to faculty and administrators. What if there is a day that we can provide that data to the students and have that clarity of expectations and pacing? And could that be a powerful tool to have the students, be in charge of their own destiny in a way? That doesn't mean that there's no faculty support, doesn't mean that there's no intervention. But is that something that you're considering and looking at?
Definitely. And we definitely work towards that today. So our model is very much based on, a flip the classroom type of a teaching model. And so students are actually getting a study guide for themselves and immediate feedback for themselves. So before they engage with the instructor, before they get to the classroom, they can actually work through different learning objectives as many times as they want in a way that's not graded. And they can get a self-study guide even at the before the midterm or before other quizzes, to say, oh, here are the areas where, I may need to go back and refresh, by talking about those rubrics that we talked about earlier, like clearly setting out these hierarchies of where the grading standard is set. Students get a chance to understand, more clearly what's expected of them and how they're going to be assessed, if you will, and they, you know, can continue to work their way up the scale. And then we grade all our questions, not grade, but they're assigned a difficulty score. And so we take a lot of time to map these to learning objectives and then the difficulty and the complexity of how the question is. And then we can give that feedback to the student in real time as they prepare for class, not, you know, after they've already failed the test. So that's really where we try to deploy most of that, is how do we get them, you know, prepared for class. And I think I haven't seen the numbers, you know, this semester, but roughly 92% of students show up prepared, quote unquote, prepared for class in our classrooms.
That's great. I know students crave immediate feedback, and that's really a great way to learn, rather than push something out there, wait, you know, weeks, days before you know what you did right and what you did wrong. That's fantastic.
Right, right. And there's a lot of anxiety with that. And we see a lot of anxiety in students today as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brian, for sharing your thoughts there. And I think this is the kind of conversation that we need between the EdTech product owners and the higher education leaders, which will help us define in terms of what it needs to be done to make every individual student successful. I think at least what I gained out of this particular question was that, you know, there is a definite need for having low-tech, uh, you know, education methodologies, like, for example, the text-based one. And of course, then there's some high end as well that's required, like simulations, wherein people can master their skills. But at the end of it, analytics will also play a very big role in terms of measuring what's the success rate and what needs to be done if there is any course correction that requires to be done. So thank you once again, Brian, Marwan, for sharing those thoughts on that. That was very insightful discussion. I think we can go hours and hours on this particular topic, but just for this virtual panel discussion, we'll move ahead with our agenda. So now we'll take a quick look at the components of conventional outcome-based education model. And so basically there are three key components: curriculum, planning and design, teaching process, authentic assessment. Now we can come back and definitely question that, hey, these components are part of every education model. That is correct. More or less, every education model will have these components. The only difference is, what is the definition of these components in an outcome-based education model? For example, teaching process. In the conventional education model or the standard education model, teaching process is about completing the curriculum in a given time period. But in outcome-based education model, as Marwan was saying, it's not about the input, it's about the output. So the focus is not on completing the curriculum, but the focus is on helping students master the skills. So that's the kind of the difference here in terms of the standard education model and the conventional, outcome-based education model. So once we have looked at these three components, let's move ahead and let's pose a question to Brian in terms of, Brian, could you share some of your thoughts at Perseverant? How are you blending technology and instructional pedagogy to make full use of outcome-based education model?
Yes, I think on many ways we cover, that's got a lot of feedback, sorry. Most of the things that you talked about here. So what we do at the beginning is actually work with the instructor to help do the instructional design on their course. And they probably have, clear vision. Sometimes it's really clear. Sometimes it's a little more foggy on how they want the class to run. They haven't thought through maybe 100% of how they want the course to run. Other instructors have. And then we help them work through that whole course design and implementation process. Very much a white glove service, but thinking about that setup is really important. And it does take quite a bit of time to set up a course, right? If you want to map learning objectives, you need to know what the learning objectives are, right? If you want to have quizzes, questions, other types of engagement mechanisms and content that help students learn those, you need to have those prepared as well. And then those questions need to be created and digitally mapped and all these things. So there's a lot that goes into that setup phase to make sure that the course itself is set up, digitally, to support the instructor. And again, that isn't weighing the, instructor or the student down, by the way, right? We want that to be not a barrier for either party, but an enabler for both parties. And so, trying to make sure we cross that chasm is probably the most important part. And then, assessment outcomes, obviously, hopefully the instructor has, set that up and thought through that, and we enable that for them at the pace that they would like to do that. So some will have, a different number of exams, a different number of quizzes, et cetera. We can set up all those assessments for them and make sure that they're ready to go. And then in terms of the pedagogy side, we're really about micro learning and supporting flip the classroom. So getting as many students through these short bursts of learning where they can get quick feedback. We talked about that a few times. Students, I think want that feedback. They want to know how they're doing. And then getting them prepared to engage in the classroom in the best way possible in the classroom could be, any type of spectrum of low tech to high tech. We have a lot of education that is in wellness. And so many times students are even outside the classroom in those sessions, and they're just implementing maybe, things that they learned in class, or testing out things like doing a Rockport walk test or something. They might be doing some of those things, in their class time.
Thank you, Brian. And yes, I understand that we had covered a lot of this question, the answer to this question in our previous discussion as well. But thank you very much for sharing that thoughts. And moving ahead in terms of, again, Marwan, you might have laid out some of the expectations, but I'll still take this opportunity to ask this question to you in terms of what is your expectation as a higher education leader from EdTech community when it comes to implementing a next-gen outcome-based education model, which will prepare the students for the future workplace?
How much time do we have, Rahul? All joking aside, I really I have a new perspective on this question. Again, given the role of reimagining the educational experience and getting to work on the types of learning design that is non-traditional in a way, but implemented within traditional education. I'd start with perhaps a design thinking methodology of empathizing with the student, rather than providing yet another tool to the faculty, another platform, another learning management system, another plugin into the learning management system, is empathizing with the student and understanding what is it that they're struggling with, what are the opportunities that we have to help the student out, and think about designing an engaging experience. So technology is certainly part of it, but how does technology, content, and even the story come together? Because when people say simulation, the preconceived notion is this, it's a big complex thing, but it doesn't have to be. Simulation can be about content that's implemented, that's story-based, that's relevant, that the students will encounter when they enter the job market, or things that may be relevant to what they're doing today. So how can we bring that into, as I said, a learning experience, as opposed to, let's build what the faculty wants us to build and put it in this new shiny box. And don't get me wrong, faculty and subject matter experts are still the core. And we always talk about innovating with the faculty as opposed to innovating to them. But in a lot of ways, I consider my job a success if I made faculty just a little bit nervous, right? What are we doing? How are we doing this? Can we do this? Then I think we're in the right track to build a new learning experience and put it in front of the student, validate that it really did solve a problem before we're putting it out there. And students didn't necessarily tell us that they want a text messaging tool or a mobile game to build, to learn medical terminology, but we knew that they were struggling with a communication barrier with faculty and they were nervous. We knew that they're struggling with gaining as much knowledge from the lecture because they didn't have the prerequisite knowledge to enter that week one lecture. So starting with that empathy phase is, I think, is the key to designing that next generation model that will ultimately achieve that outcome at the end.
And Marwan, I'm glad that you brought that point up in terms of design thinking and empathizing with the students. I think never ever there has been a time when there has been so much focus on empathizing. And at Harbinger, when we go about designing our products, of course, design thinking is a part of our DNA. But we have started giving a lot of focus on empathy mapping in terms of what the user is saying, how the user is feeling, what the user is thinking. So in terms of, it's not about one product that fits for all, but empathy mapping has become a key part of how we design products. And that's important. I think that's something which everyone should take a note of it. And thank you very much for bringing that point up, Marwan. Right, so with that, now let me take a moment and let me invite a few guests. Basically, they are leaders in the education industry in their own domain. So we want to invite them and we want to listen from them in terms of how they have been implementing outcome-based education model and what kind of successes or any challenges that they have seen. So we just want to listen some of their thoughts. So first guest that we have for today is Brendan Butts. He's joining us from Trinidad and Tobago, the Caribbeans. Brendan, good morning. How are you doing today?
Morning, Rahul. I'm quite fine, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to participate in this event.
Thank you, Brendan, for taking the time out for this. Brendan, so just for our audience, if you could quickly tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do.
Absolutely, thank you. Well, I've been a teacher administrator at the primary and secondary levels in Trinidad and Tobago for about 27 years now. And I founded a company called ESS Limited back in 2013. And our main activity is teacher training in leveraging ICTs in pedagogy with a focus on interactive and collaborative technologies. Our mission is to contribute to the upskilling of our teachers in Trinidad and Tobago, as well as the wider Caribbean, so that they're able to successfully transition to a blended learning environment, more so since the onset of COVID. And one of our main goals, and a challenge that we face regularly in a developing nation like ours, is the creation of authentic and relevant content. So that's a bit of the background of myself and our company.
Thank you, Brendan, and we wish you all the best in this endeavor that you have. I think that's a great task that you have at your hands in terms of upskilling teachers. You know, they're good at teaching, right? They might have been teaching for 20 years, 30 years, so they're masters at what they do, but they now have to quickly upskill themselves to be able to deliver in this digital and blended environment. And that might be a totally new ballgame for them. So we wish you all the best in this endeavor. And so Brendan, in terms of the teacher training programs that you run, can you kind of talk a little bit about us in terms of how are you implementing?
Sure. Sure, absolutely. So a recent project we started back in November last year was a teacher training on how to teach effectively online, as this was relatively brand new to most of our teachers in Trinidad and Tobago, as well as the digital lesson creation and content development using Smart Learning Suite. As I said, the project started last November, and it was mainly due to a call from our Ministry of Education for corporate Trinidad and Tobago to join in a national Adopt a School program to provide devices to students. So we joined forces with these corporate partners to provide training to the teachers in order to leverage those devices, where student engagement was our main concern. The training certainly drew on certain facets and characteristics of the OBE model. We needed to ensure that it was student-centric. Of course, in this case, our students were the participating teachers, where mastery over the particular skills could have been demonstrated and measured. And teachers would demonstrate their understanding by producing a digital lesson which they would have created using the tools available and what they learned during the course. Feedback between facilitator and teachers would be ongoing until the teachers were satisfied that their lessons contained the elements and content that would really engage their students. Feedback also came from peer reviews during presentations where of validation. And the icing on the cake for us was that the teachers, when they presented their lessons to students, their work was further validated by the increased level of engagement they experienced. This would have resulted in teachers refining their lessons further, as well as motivating them to produce more highly interactive and engaging lessons. And this ultimately led to teachers exceeding their own expectations. Quite frankly, I must admit that my own expectations were exceeded as well. A second characteristic we found that was very important, drawing from the OBE model, was flexibility. It was extremely important to allow teachers to have a say in when their training would be, how they were going to be assessed, and what form the assessment would take. This becomes more critical for adult learners, which was quite challenging for participating teachers, because they were balancing working from home, taking care of their families, and now participating in a teacher training program. So we needed to expand the opportunities for them by providing more chances to participate and demonstrate their learning, which would result in successful learning experiences for all teachers. And this was very important. So we needed to give them those countless opportunities to be successful. So if we were to highlight some main points of the OBE model that fit in with our training program, they would be to provide complete assistance for learners as when they face challenges and adequate time to achieve mastery, as well as applied competencies, where the focus would be on practical knowledge, knowing how to do the things and the ability to make decisions, a fundamental learning, which they keep questioning themselves, understanding why they were doing what they were doing. And of course, lastly, reflecting on those learning experiences from the feedback that they would have gotten throughout the course, especially from their students, and applying their knowledge appropriately and responsibly. So again, reinforcing that the focus here is more on the output than the input. So I'm not sure, I hope I summed up basically how we utilized the key facets of the OBE in our training model.
And thank you, Brendan. I think what you said was the way you summarized it at the end of it, that's where we started actually. And what Marwan had said that, it's not about input, but it's about output focus. And the way you highlighted the part wherein it's about demonstrating and measuring whether the skills have been mastered or not, that's one of the key. So these are some of the components of the outcome-based education model. And Brendan, once again, thank you very much for joining us on the show. And please stay tuned. Please be with us. We'll like to have you on the Q&A panel as well. I'm sure people would like to ask questions. And again, we'll take this opportunity and wish you all the best in the teacher training programs that you're doing. That's a great work that you're doing, and especially in your part of the world when it's a developing economy there. Right. So with that,
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Brendan. And with that, let me welcome our second guest for the today. And we're very thankful that Brenda could make some time out and join us today. Brenda, she's the Chief Academic Officer, Paradigm Learning Systems. When I talk to Brenda, whenever I get an opportunity to talk to Brenda on web or on phone, I feel I'm back in my college days. So that's, that's Brenda's effect. So thank you, Brenda, for joining us on this panel discussion.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Brenda, once again, thank you very much for taking the time. For our audience, if you could, just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
I started as a teacher, educator. I've been doing what we called then mastery-based learning for at least 30 years. And I am co-founder now with my colleague who is the Chief Executive Officer in Paradigm Learning Systems. We first started working together a number of years ago where we had the opportunity to take a local school district from a statewide placement of 164th out of 195 schools school districts to 8th in the state in 3 years by completely changing their instructional model, design, instruction, assessment, every aspect of it, retraining the teachers, redesigning the curriculum. And so we've taken that since to other countries and other programs and expanded it to higher ed and also businesses and corporations and government agencies, nonprofits. And so we design learning models that are outcomes-based, but that are specifically according to our proprietary scaffolded design model. And so that we know we are covering 4 domains and at least 4 levels of learning. For adults, we often go to a 5th level of learning for systematization of what they've produced in their project-based learning.
Right. Thank you, Brenda. And from an instructional design perspective, I'm sure when we open up for the Q&A, people would definitely like to hear from you in terms of what are some of the things that we should take care of when it comes to instructional design to ensure that we can leverage the outcome-based education model. Right. So,
well, I would like to suggest a couple of the premises that you set up may not be fully complete for anyone who's actually doing the design. The World Economic Forum may be focused on what businesses need, but educators are focused on what the learners will need to get to that point. So we would have to include executive functioning skills and social intelligence. We would want to be able to develop in the students sustained attention, working memory, response inhibition, goal-directed persistence, and metacognition, so that they can continue learning from themselves and directing their own learning. And as far as the design outcome, we definitely would go beyond assessment to improvement. And you listed teaching in there, but you didn't list learning. Teaching and learning can be very different things.
Right, and thank you, Brenda. That sounds very interesting. In terms of teaching and learning, definitely these two things are very different. And I would request you to please stay back for the Q&A session, because the audience might have some questions for you. And we'll open up for the Q&A session in the next couple of minutes. So I think we are coming towards the end of the discussion. And once again, I would like to thank our panelists and our guests for today for sharing those thoughts. This is one topic on which we can go on for ages discussing. And it's very important, because this is where we are developing economies. This is where we are developing nations. This is where we are developing the future of our kids, I would say. So this is definitely a very interesting, a very important topic to ponder upon. And it should have a lot of say. It should have a say from parents, from teachers, from policymakers. Everyone should have a say in terms of how we move forward together to create the next-gen outcome-based education model and ensure that the lessons that we have learned in the past, we can keep building upon that. I was just going through the history of outcome-based education model, and I was just reading it on the wiki. And there's a lot of interesting stories and theories around it. I mean, the audience, anyone in the audience wants to get a look at it, take a look at it, please feel free to do. So the key takeaways that we take away from this discussion is the need for the next-gen outcome-based education model to bridge the gap between academia and the workplace of future, and the 3 key things that are required to prepare the students for the post-COVID job market. And with that, I will hand it over to Rohan to summarize it and open us up for the Q&A session. Thank you, Rohan.
Hey, thank you so much, Rahul, and thank you to all our panelists for your time today. So for our audience, we're open for questions. Please feel free to type them down in the chat or even in the Q&A pane, and we'll be happy to answer them for you. So Rahul, I can see a couple of questions there on the chat already. So one question says, I would like to know what are some form of outcome-based models which we could use as a reference?
Every one of our models is outcome-based and could be used as a reference. We have K-12, we have higher ed, we have models to take, we call campus to career, so to see where we take students from freshman year through their first year of work, and we teach them to be the CEOs of their own life, to market themselves, to have a brand, to network appropriately, and all the life skills of being away from home for the first time. We have a number of models from preschool to government and nonprofits, and all of them are outcome-based.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Brenda. We have another question. So how are outcome-based models different for education institutes and enterprises? So anyone from our panelists would like to take that?
In my experience, because I've been in enterprises, the people who are put in charge of enterprise learning aren't necessarily educators. There might be trainers, but there's a sort of a different approach to that. And so they think in terms of, this is the curriculum we are giving you, instead of this is the student, we want them to get here, how do we do that? And so all of our programs are individualized. They're self-paced, but also self-directed. The students become the directors of their learning. They're involved in the planning of their learning model. And we try to work with the training directors, the training managers, on making sure that the philosophy of the company, their program, and the learning model that they're using are all matched. Because when you have mismatches of philosophy, you'll have some misunderstandings of what the expectations are across the board.
Got it. Great. I think, yeah, we had these couple of questions. Again, thank you so much to all our panelists who have joined us today, and to all our audience, even the ones who have joined LinkedIn. So we're live on LinkedIn. So thank you so much for your active participation. And definitely today we are going back with some food for thought. And in the meanwhile, if you still have any questions, please feel free to drop us a line at hsinfo@harbingergroup.com. We'll be happy to take them offline. And just in case, if you want to get in touch with any of our panelists, you can drop us a line on the same email address as well. So again, thank you so much, everyone. It was a great session, and we look forward to staying connected with you. Take care and have a great day ahead.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.